Turning to you, Anthony, there's so much goodwill for Aboriginal Australians in our community, but we currently spend an enormous amount of money every year trying to make the life situation of that disadvantaged section of our community improve. And the Aboriginal people I speak to tell me they are almost over-consulted, consulted on everything till the cows come home, and that itself is frustrating. Surely there's a different recipe for progress in this space.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I've been saying for many years, in fact, Gary, when we first started having a conversation 25 years ago, my claim was that we need to recognise that the commonalities between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people far outweigh the differences. And any program, service, intervention that assumes that Aboriginal people are fundamentally different to non-Aboriginal people is doomed to fail. So, yes, you know, there may be different circumstances, but we need to approach this, you know, closing the gap, helping Aboriginal people with the assumption that they have the same fundamental needs as non-Aboriginal people and work from there. And I think The Voice is, from what I've seen so far, you know, is pushing this message, you know, Aboriginal people are so different that only Aboriginal people can understand them. And we've got to have this official Aboriginal voice speaking on their behalf. And, you know, as the two of you have already alluded to, and other speakers such as Jacinta, we've got many Aboriginal voices today, but the dominant ones that, you know, high profile seem to be saying, you know, Aboriginal people are so fundamentally different, we've got to take a different approach to them. And that can only ever fail.
Anthony, ATSIC was, I think, on any assessment, something of a disaster for Aboriginal Australians. Why do people assume that a constitutionally entrenched voice to Parliament will be a different experience?
Maybe just that, you know, they think, well, constitution, that'll give it more power, more weight. It won't. I think it'll only just, you know, formalise the bad things we've already seen. That is, you know, the assumption that Aboriginal people are fundamentally different to non-Aboriginal people. You know, I'm all for some form of recognition in the Constitution, but as you and other people who are better informed when it comes to constitutional topics, it's going to get very, very messy. And, you know, as myself and a few others have said, we know that many Aboriginal people, including the main architects of The Voice, have done very well for themselves without tinkering with the Constitution. And we know what the recipe for success is, whether you be Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal. You need an education, you need access to good education, access to jobs, access to safe environments. And that's something we can work on right now. Why shouldn't we be working on that right now, rather than putting all this money into The Voice and the Yes vote?
I think there's a lot of well-meaning people who just say, well, the other things we've tried didn't work, so this must be the thing to do. And that's a weak basis, I'm sure. Anyone would agree in logic. What are the practical things we should be doing, you've alluded to some of them, to improve the lot of people, particularly in those really remote places?
Okay, first of all, generally speaking, those Indigenous people who have made it have either they've been born into good circumstances like myself, or they've escaped. There's been an exit strategy for them to access modern services and opportunities and that sort of thing. So, you know, we know generally speaking, where the problem areas are. It's with those Indigenous people who are living in remote areas that don't have access to the sorts of services you and I and everyone else take for granted. So we either need to bring the services to them, and someone like Warren Mundine is a good person for talking about remote areas and development and getting in services and jobs and that sort of thing. Or if that's not viable, well, then we do need to make the tough decision of moving the people to where the services are. And I'm not saying just rip the people up from the land. We need a sensible and sensitive exit strategy to locate them in places where they're going to have access to fresh food, modern services and that sort of thing.
Yeah, too right. It's that unfashionable but important concept. It's actually about integration with the modern world and, you know, working together rather than entrenching difference. Gary, you've written a great book on this subject, The Burden of Culture. It's available through Quadrant Books. I'm always up for a book plug. It's a really brave book, though, and I think it offers some practical solutions on these really important matters. What's your prescription as it relates to the need to help people get the skills and the integration they need to be able to flourish?
Well, let's add to Anthony's notion of the exit strategy. Part of that exit strategy has to be inside the mind. The way people live, the culture under which they live, is hurting them, right? This is the sort of thing you celebrate on the East Coast, but it is a damned thing in Northern Australia. People are behaving in ways that are not suited to a modern economy and a modern world. They're harming each other. So part of the exit strategy really is to talk to families when the children are very, very young and make it quite clear to them, if they stay here, if they maintain an attitude that says, I don't need to go to school, I don't need the white man's world, I accept we want them to deliver all the goodies as a matter of, paying the rent. There has to be a change of attitude that was apparent in Aboriginal leaders up until about the 1970s, before these new leaders became so arrogant that they say, in fact, that they're better than us.
Anthony, Gary's book talks about the Aboriginal industry. What does that concept mean, this Aboriginal industry, and why should we be concerned about it? What does it look like on the ground?
Yeah. One part of the part which I focus on often is the assumption that only Aboriginal people can understand Aboriginal people and therefore should only access an Aboriginal service. And I have nothing against good quality Aboriginal services. Indeed, I've been privileged to be associated with a few of them. But the insistence that right across the board, Aboriginal people need to access only an Aboriginal type service can be very damaging to them. And, when you follow this to the logical end, or close to the logical end, one area where this is particularly evident and the damage is very clear is the insistence of Aboriginal kids who need care and protection should only be placed in the hands of Aboriginal carers. Again, I have no problem if the carer is Aboriginal and they provide a loving, caring, nurturing home. But far too often, we know these stories, and I've heard them from people who tell me the kid goes from one bad environment to another bad environment. So it should be, rein in the powers of the Aboriginal industry and focus on quality. So, for example, with what I just spoke about, kids in care, go to any home, regardless of the colour of the carers, so long as they are competent, caring, and provide a safe home. So again, I'm not saying Aboriginal people should never access an Aboriginal service, but there should be a choice, and those services should be held to a high standard, just like any other service. But again, this is all rooted in this myth that Aboriginal people are fundamentally different to non-Aboriginal people, and therefore only Aboriginal people can speak on behalf of and act on behalf of other Aboriginal people.
Well, it should be what's on the inside that counts, and that's one of the things I love about both of you, gentlemen. Thank you so much for your time tonight, Gary Johns and Anthony Dillon.